Russia is burning at Kupiansk, not metaphorically, literally. At this hour, the smoke rising over the Oskil River is not the smoke of a Russian victory. It is the smoke of a 100,000-man grouping that was promised a city by February and has instead been handed a graveyard. Vladimir Putin stood in front of cameras on the 19th of December and told the Russian people that Kupiansk was surrounded, that Ukrainian forces were trapped, that foreign journalists could come and see it for themselves under a 5 to 6 hour ceasefire he was personally prepared to grant. Let that sink in for a moment. The president of a nuclear power, the supreme commander of the Russian armed forces, publicly offered a temporary pause in his own war so that reporters could witness a victory that did not exist. Within 72 hours, those same Ukrainian forces he claimed were encircled had cut his logistics on the Oskil, sealed off his vanguard inside the high-rise district, and reduced his so-called liberators to roughly 200 men hiding in basements. By early February, that number was down to 50. By late February, Ukrainian military intelligence was describing them as dwindling. This is not a story about one city on the Kharkiv front. This is a story about what happens when a 100,000-man army built on Soviet doctrine collides with a Ukrainian force that has spent 4 years learning how to make Russian mass go dark. What you are witnessing is not a stalled offensive. You are witnessing the operational suffocation of an entire Russian grouping in real time, and the mainstream framing is missing it almost entirely. The headlines tell you Russia is advancing. The map tells you a different story. The casualty ratios tell you a third story. And the doctrinal evidence underneath all of it tells you the fourth and most important one. The Russian theory of victory at Kupiansk was never going to work, and Moscow knew it before the offensive began. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. To understand why Kupiansk has become the most expensive failure of Russia's 2025 campaign, you have to rewind to the assumptions Moscow brought into this fight. In late 2024, after Russian forces reestablished positions along the Oskil and pushed back into the eastern edges of Kupiansk, the general staff in Moscow made a series of bets. They bet that Ukrainian manpower on the Kharkiv axis was thinner than on the Donetsk axis. They bet that the Oskil River, with its rough terrain, fog, and seasonal weather, would provide concealment for Russian infiltration. They bet that a sustained pressure operation by the 6th Combined Arms Army, reinforced by elements drawn from the broader Western grouping of forces, could collapse the city through attrition the same way Avdiivka had collapsed. And they bet that Western political fatigue would degrade Ukrainian artillery resupply just as the assault peaked. Every one of those bets has now failed, not partially, categorically. The first mistake was not tactical, it was psychological. Russian commanders and Putin personally believed that Ukraine in 2025 was the Ukraine of 2023, the Ukraine that lost Avdiivka inch by bloody inch because it lacked shells, drones, and electronic warfare capacity. That Ukraine no longer exists. The Ukraine defending Kupiansk today is something else entirely. It is an integrated drone artillery electronic warfare system that has been refined in 19 successive city battles, and it has been waiting on the Oskil for precisely the kind of frontal pressure operation that the Russian Western grouping was ordered to execute. On paper, the Russian grouping looked overwhelming. Roughly 100,000 personnel concentrated across the Kupiansk and Borova axes, supported by glide bomb sorties, supported by the remnants of Russian airborne reserves, supported by the kind of artillery mass that defined the early phases of this war. On the actual battlefield, that assumption failed within weeks, because mass without communications is not mass. It is a target list, and it gets even more serious from here. Pull the lens back. Between the late autumn of 2024 and the autumn of 2025, Ukrainian forces on the Kupiansk axis did something the Russian General Staff still does not appear to understand. And they did not fortify the city in the traditional sense. They turned the entire approach corridor from the Oskil tributaries to the urban edge into a sensor strike environment. Every square kilometer between Sinkivka and the western bank of the Oskil became a layered kill zone of reconnaissance drones, FPV strike drones, fiber optic drones immune to jamming, pre-registered artillery, and mobile electronic warfare platforms designed to sever Russian command links the moment an assault group crossed a known infiltration line. By the time the Russian offensive reached its peak intensity in the late summer of 2025, the kill ratio on the Kupiansk axis had reached a number that should have triggered a complete operational reassessment in Moscow. 27 Russian soldiers killed for every one Ukrainian soldier killed in the battle for the city itself. 27 to 1. That is not the math of a successful offensive. That is the math of an army being fed into a machine by commanders who have lost the right to be called professionals. By October, Ukrainian and Western analysts were openly describing Kupiansk as the graveyard of Russia's 6th Combined Arms Army, with cumulative Russian killed across the broader Kharkiv axis estimated at 13,000 and 2 armies effectively burned through. This matters enormously, and here is why mainstream coverage keeps missing it. When Western reporting describes Russian advances near Kupiansk, it describes them in territorial terms. A village taken here, a tree line gained there. Tyshchenkivka, Holubivka, Kurylivka, Podoli. The map moves a few hundred meters and the headline writes itself. But this is the wrong unit of measurement. The correct unit of measurement is the cost of those meters, the survivability of the units that took them, and the operational consequences for the larger Russian grouping. By every one of those measures, Russia is not advancing at Kupiansk. Russia is dissolving at Kupiansk. This is the moment to introduce the hidden military variable because without it, none of what comes next makes sense. The variable is command coherence. Modern combined arms warfare does not function without continuous, redundant, encrypted communications between assault groups, fire support, drone operators, and rear area logistics. The Soviet system that Russia inherited and never modernized assumed that commanders 1 or 2 levels above the contact line would push orders downward by radio, by wire, by runner if necessary, and that subordinate units would execute. That system worked in 1945. It works in 2025 only if your enemy allows it to work. The Ukrainian forces around Kupiansk have decided at the doctrinal level that they will not allow it to work. What the Ukrainian General Staff has built along the Oskol is, in practical terms, a communications denial bubble. Russian assault groups that cross into the kill zone find that their radios are jammed within minutes. Their drones lose signal. Their fire support requests do not reach the battery. Their reinforcement calls do not reach the company commander. And when they do, the company commander himself has often already been struck by a precision drone that identified him by his antenna pattern. This is what I mean when I say the 100,000-man army went dark. I do not mean it metaphorically. I mean that across vast stretches of the Kupiansk axis, individual Russian platoons and companies are now operating without contact with their own chain of command, without coordinated fire support, without resupply, and in many cases, without knowing where the rest of their own battalion is located. Let that sink in. 100,000 men deployed, equipped, paid, and ordered into combat by a state that cannot guarantee they can talk to each other once they cross the river. And here is the counterintuitive reframe the headlines refuse to make. The Russian infiltration tactic that Western media keeps describing as clever, the use of underground gas pipelines, the small group penetrations through Holubivka, the 2-man and 3-man teams sneaking into the high-rise district, none of that is innovation. It is desperation. Russian small groups are crawling through pipes because Russian battalion-level operations no longer function. When an army that fought for Mariupol in regimental columns has been reduced to sending pairs of men through sewage infrastructure to seize an apartment building, that army is not adapting. That army has been operationally broken and is searching for any method of advance that does not require the communications it no longer has. Pull the lens back further because this pattern repeats across every axis of this war, and Kupiansk is now the clearest case study we have. By the autumn of 2025, Ukrainian forces had begun a series of counterattacks around the Kupiansk axis that ISW assessed as stabilizing Ukrainian control over the broader sector. By December, Ukrainian troops had crossed the Oskol at multiple points, cut Russian logistics into the city, and surrounded the Russian vanguard that had penetrated the urban core. The Russian response was not military. It was rhetorical. On the 12th of December, Putin claimed Ukrainian forces were surrounded. On the 19th, he offered the ceasefire for journalists stunt during his annual direct line broadcast. By the 4th of February, the Ukrainska Pravda reporting was clear. Up to 50 Russian soldiers remained encircled inside Kupiansk. By the 27th of February, Ukrainian military spokespeople were describing the besieged Russians in the high-rises as dwindling, with intercepted radio traffic indicating roughly 100 Russians at the peak of the incursion, falling to half that number within weeks. This is what defeat looks like when a kleptocratic state cannot admit defeat. It looks like a president inviting foreign reporters to inspect a victory that has already become a siege of his own men. And it gets even more serious from here, because what is happening at Kupiansk is not contained to Kupiansk. The consequences propagate upward into the industrial and state-level architecture of Russian military power, and this is where the strategic verdict begins to harden. The first industrial consequence is the bleed-out of the Russian Western grouping. The 6th Combined Arms Army, which carried the weight of the Kupiansk operation, is no longer a coherent operational formation. The units inside it have been rotated, reconstituted, and fed with mobilized replacements at a tempo that destroys institutional knowledge. When you lose 13,000 men on a single axis without taking the city, you are not just losing soldiers. You are losing the non-commissioned officers, the platoon leaders, the company commanders, the drone operators, and the signalers who would have formed the backbone of any future offensive elsewhere. Wayne Indrikis. The talent does not regenerate. It is being burned through faster than the Russian military education system can replace it. The second industrial consequence is munitions allocation. Every glide bomb dropped on Kupiansk, every Iskander fired in support of the Western grouping, every artillery round shipped from North Korean stockpiles into the Kharkiv axis is a round that is not available on the Donetsk axis, on the Zaporizhia axis, on the Pokrovsk axis. Russia has effectively chosen to pay the highest possible cost for the lowest possible operational payoff, and that decision is now compounding across the entire front. The third industrial consequence is political. When Putin tells the Russian public that Kupiansk has been liberated and the Ukrainian flag is still flying over the western part of the city, he is creating a credibility deficit inside his own command structure. ISW assessed in January that Kupiansk had become a particular point of neuralgia for the Russian military command, precisely because senior commanders fear that the truth about the Kharkiv axis, if it ever surfaces fully in Moscow, will destroy the narrative of inevitable Russian advance that the Kremlin has built its 2025 and 2026 messaging around. Commanders are now lying upward to a president who is lying downward to the public, and somewhere in the middle, the men in the basements of the Kupiansk high-rises are running out of food. The broader lesson here is not about one city. It is about what a doctrinally adapted, sensor-rich, electronic warfare integrated defender can do to a numerically superior attacker that still believes in Soviet mass. And this is where the historical verdict begins to write itself. Pull the lens back to the largest possible frame. Throughout military history, there have been moments when an attacking force discovered too late that the variable it had based its plan on no longer existed. The French in 1940 discovered that the Maginot Line did not matter because the variable had become operational tempo, not fortified depth. The Americans in Vietnam discovered that body count did not matter because the variable had become political endurance. The Russians in Afghanistan discovered that armored columns did not matter because the variable had become the helicopter-killing, shoulder-fired missile. In each case, the losing side kept trying to win the previous war while the variable that actually decided outcomes had quietly migrated somewhere else. At Kupiansk, Russia is fighting the previous war. The variable that decides whether a 100,000-man grouping succeeds or fails is no longer mass. It is not artillery tonnage. It is not the willingness of conscripts to walk forward into machine gun fire. The variable is the continuous integrity of the kill chain, the ability of small units to remain in contact with the sensors, weapons, and commanders that make them lethal. Ukraine has built a force that protects its own kill chain and destroys the enemy's. Russia has built a force that floods the battlefield with men whose kill chain collapses the moment they cross the line of contact. This is the climactic turning point, and it deserves to be named clearly. The operation that crystallized this dynamic was the Ukrainian counterattack sequence that began in October of 2025 and accelerated through December, when Ukrainian forces of the Second Corps and adjacent formations broke through to the Oskol River, severed Russian lines of communication into the city, and reduced the Russian penetration to an isolated pocket inside the urban core. That was the moment the Russian Western grouping went, in operational terms, dark. Not because Ukraine struck a single command post, although precision strikes against Russian command nodes on the Kupiansk axis have been a feature of this fight throughout. The grouping went dark because the Ukrainian system had been quietly closing around it for months, and the cut on the Oskil was the final clasp. What happened next changed not just the battle, but the logic of how this war will be fought going forward. Russian small groups began their pipeline infiltration attempts. Russian commanders began reporting upward that Kupiansk had been liberated. Putin began performing the ceasefire for journalist theater, and the Ukrainian forces, having achieved operational dominance, did not rush to retake every square meter. They did something more disciplined. They held the encirclement, let the trapped Russians consume their own supplies, let the Russian command structure continue to lie to itself, and let the casualty ratio do what casualty ratios do when one side has solved the modern battlefield and the other has not. 27-1. 13,000 killed, 2 armies burned through, 50 men left in the basements, a president on television offering a ceasefire to prove a lie. The real question is not whether Russia will eventually take Kupiansk. The real question is whether the Russian system, as currently constituted, is capable of taking any well-defended Ukrainian city without paying a price that the state itself cannot absorb. The evidence from the Kharkiv axis suggests it is not. The evidence from the parallel grinds at Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar suggests the same pattern, only slower. The evidence from the broader collapse of Russian armored reserves, drone operator pools, and trained signaler ranks suggests that the Russian military of late 2026 will be measurably weaker than the Russian military that began the year, and the Ukrainian military of late 2026 will be measurably stronger. History will record that Kupiansk was the moment the Russian theory of victory in this war stopped being plausible. Not because the city fell, not because the city was liberated, but because the offensive against the city revealed, in a way that could no longer be hidden, that a 100,000-man army built on Soviet doctrine cannot operate when its communications, its command coherence, and its kill chain are systematically denied by an adversary that has built its entire force around exactly that denial. The Russian grouping at Kupiansk did not lose because it was outnumbered. It lost because it went dark, and the dark is where modern armies die. That is the doctrinal verdict. That is the case study. And that is the pattern you will see repeat, with local variations, across every remaining axis of this war, until either Moscow accepts what has happened or Moscow runs out of the men and the materiel to keep pretending it has not. I will continue to follow this story closely because the next phase, the consolidation of Ukrainian gains along the Oskil, the reconstitution attempts by what remains of the Russian Western grouping, the political consequences inside the Kremlin as the gap between Putin's claims and battlefield reality widens, all of it is going to define the strategic shape of the coming year. If you want to stay ahead of casual news coverage on this, if you want the doctrinal interpretation rather than the headline, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. We are working toward a serious community of viewers who want to understand this war at the level it is actually being fought, and every subscription helps us get there. The story at Kupiansk is not finished. The lessons from it are only beginning to be absorbed in the capitals that need to absorb them. And the next set of questions, what Moscow does when it can no longer hide the cost, what Kiev does with the operational initiative it has earned, what Washington and Brussels do with the evidence now in front of them, those questions do not have simple answers. Stay with me. We will work through them together.